Welcome to the Disability News Report. I'm your host, Jennifer Price, where we are here to change the narrative of mainstream conversations. We are talking about various topics that are already being discussed, but making sure to intentionally include people with disabilities in those conversations. So today I'm going to be talking about human trafficking. It's a topic that is getting more and more garnering more and more attention, especially here in the United States. I believe people in the United States are beginning to really understand that this is not simply an international human relations issue that other countries need to figure out and handle, that it does happen here in the United States. It is a billion with a billion dollar industry. But one thing that I think many people don't realize is that people with disabilities can be particularly vulnerable to traffickers and to being trafficked. So that is what we're going to be talking about today. My guest is Sarah Bessel, the Deputy Director of the Human Trafficking Legal Center, and she's going to talk to us about what's going on with the people with disabilities being trafficked, why they can be targeted by traffickers, and what are some of the red flags, and how we can help if you are a person with a disability or have a loved one with a disability. What is it that you need to know in order to prevent it from happening? All of that coming up next. So, Sarah, thanks for being on. I'm glad to talk about this such important topic.
Yeah, my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd like to first just start out with the Human Trafficking Legal Center where you work. What exactly does your organization do?
So, we are a US based organization and we provide training and technical assistance to pro bono attorneys based in the US to represent trafficking survivors in criminal, civil, and immigration matters. And essentially, our aim is to use access to justice and encourage access to justice to seek remedies for human trafficking survivors. And as part of that work, we also do a significant amount of legal research and analysis, and we maintain two databases of every federal, civil, and criminal trafficking case in the United States. And that is what led us to our research on the trafficking of persons with disabilities.
Oh, wow. Well, then I would imagine your breadth of research is pretty thick, quite frankly, if you're, keeping track of everything that's going on across the country. I mean, I've definitely gone through the website and have become more and more familiar of just how common it is, and we're gonna get into some of the cases that have come up. But first, let's just start with the definition of human trafficking, because it's my understanding it's a pretty broad definition, and it can look like and take many forms. So what exactly is human trafficking?
Sure. So the United States takes its definition of trafficking in part from the International Palermo Protocol, which the U.S. is a signatory to, and we're slightly different from some other countries that include human trafficking and say forced labor into one statute. We actually break apart in our federal law human trafficking into its own crime. So we have the crime of human trafficking, which is there's several actions you can take, including the recruitment, the harboring, the transportation, the obtaining, the providing of a person for the purpose of, and then the two other statutes are forced labor or commercial sex. And so we also criminalize under US federal law forced labor and also commercial sex.
Okay, and so when it comes to people with disabilities, what are some of the factors that can make people with disabilities particularly vulnerable to being trafficked in the first place?
Sure. So, one reason that persons with disabilities might be more vulnerable to traffickers is that, in general, victims with disabilities, and this is not just with respect to trafficking, but just in crimes in general, tend to report crimes less frequently, owing in part to the fact that victims might know their perpetrator, or because of the nature of their disability, might prevent them from actually reporting the crime. And in fact, the Office of Victims of Crime in the United States has data that says that people with disabilities are 2 times as likely to be the victims of violent crimes. And so the fact that persons with disabilities might have a pre existing relationship with their trafficker makes them incredibly vulnerable. So, for example, there's a case US versus Callahan in the Northern District of Ohio, where it was a young homeless woman with cognitive disabilities who had a young child, and she was initially befriended by a couple who invited her to come live with them and become their roommate. And then eventually they forced her into providing domestic work, and they stole her disability benefits, and the male defendant sexually abused her.
Oh,
In
no.
another case we see in Missouri, US v. Bagley, the survivor was a young woman with cognitive disabilities who was aging out of foster care, and her then boyfriend invited her to live with him and his family. And then after she moved in with the family, her boyfriend's father forced her to sign a sex slave contract that,
Oh,
due to her disability, she thought was legally binding. And then they forced her in a scheme, they forced her into working at strip clubs and into commercial sex. So that's one aspect that might make persons with disabilities vulnerable to traffickers and exploitation. But another factor is the fact of their Social Security income and their Social Security benefits.
mhm.
And so we've also seen cases in which traffickers target persons with disabilities specifically to steal their disability benefits. And then on top of that, another layer of criminality is to force them into trafficking. So in a case in Pennsylvania, a very horrible case, US v. Weston, the defendants targeted individuals with various disabilities in order to steal their SSI benefits. They befriended them, they invited them to move in, and they eventually became the representative payees of the victims. And in the case of two individuals, they forced those two individuals into commercial sex and held all of the individuals in really horrible conditions and malnourished them and physically abused them, all for the purpose of the scheme, in addition to the trafficking of stealing their disability benefits. So those are just some of the ways in which people with disabilities can be vulnerable to persons who would exploit them.
Well, I can certainly say that I became aware of this issue by reading an article of, I can't remember what state it was this occurred, but there was a girl who was a stripper, and so the news article was about how she was a stripper, and she had intellectual disabilities, but the owner of the club was being prosecuted for using the strip club as hit the funnel for not just of intentionally seeking out people with disabilities into the strip club to then use and take advantage of them in different respects. So that's when I became aware of the connection between the two of them. But I read on your website also, and I think you kind of touched on it, but I just want to clarify the forced labor aspect of it. What are we talking about when we say forced labor?
Sure. So forced labor under our federal statute includes, it's a broad definition. The statute includes labor or services. So in the case in Ohio, I mentioned that the victim provided domestic work. We see lots of cases involving domestic workers held in home, trapped in homes, forced to provide domestic services, child care, etc., for little to no pay and for long hours.
Mm.
Other forms of forced labor include agricultural work, harvesting, working in tree farms. We've also seen forced labor occur on shipyards, construction sites. So it's a broad range of a broad range of labor activities.
So are there any red flags that we can look for, if we suspect that someone may be being subjected to trafficking?
I think in general, there's lack of payment. If there is a victim or there's a person in your community who is you think might not be allowed out. So, for example, I'm thinking of the domestic worker context. We've seen cases in which communities of faith, where the domestic workers go for religious services, have been a point of intervention for that domestic worker. In terms of construction workers, for example, if you start to see workplace violations, that might be a telling sign of potentially trafficking, if not labor exploitation. And so lack of breaks, lack of workplace safety notices and safety equipment, et cetera. So depending on the industry, there can be multiple signs.
Okay. And so are you saying from the perspective of, let's just use the construction site, for example, if you maybe you are a construction worker and you're receiving breaks, but a coworker is not receiving breaks, then maybe possibly, or a group of coworkers are not receiving breaks, maybe that group could be subjected to trafficking.
It depends on the situation. It could be a lesser form of labor exploitation, so which in some situations can rise to the level of human trafficking. But certainly there would be workplace violations going on, and we certainly see cases in which, for example, foreign nationals who are recruited to work on a construction site are treated differently from U.S. nationals who are also working on the site.
Mhm.
And so, if you're seeing discriminatory behavior between the two groups, that might be another sign that something is shifty and going on.
And so, is
It's
there anything that? Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, and then another sign is just oftentimes, and especially with persons with disabilities, we see that traffickers attempt to isolate victims from their friends and family. So we saw that in the case in Ohio, we saw that in the case in Pennsylvania, and many other cases. And so if you have a loved one or a friend who it's becoming harder and harder to reach out to them or have contact with them because you think someone is starting to isolate them from their community and their safety net, that's another warning sign as well.
Isolation. Okay. And so, is there anything that we can do to prevent it from happening?
So, if you think someone is in danger or in a trafficking situation, I would recommend that you reach out to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. It is a nationally run hotline where you can provide tips on human trafficking situations. It's also available for survivors or victims themselves to call. So you can encourage someone to reach out to the Human Trafficking Hotline as well, and they can hopefully be paired with a caseworker and referral services to help them out of their trafficking situation.
All right. Are there any final tips? Did you like to give your website also if someone wants to just kind of stay up to date as to some of the cases that are happening?
Sure. Our website is htlegalcenter.org, and you can go there to sign up for our newsletter and keep abreast of our most recent publications and data. And feel free, if you have any inquiries, feel free to reach out to us at info@htlegalcenter.org, and we're happy to respond to inquiries.
All right. Sarah, thanks for coming on. I do appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.